Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. My name is Jon M. Sweeney. I am the editor here at Living City Magazine. We're delighted that you have joined us for this webinar on the subject of our current issue of the magazine, which is called Celebrity in the Church, Past, Present, and Challenges. We have two of our feature writers with us for this webinar. Thank you to them for giving us an hour of their time. They are Timothy P. O'Malley and Cassidy Klein. Let me just briefly introduce both of them to you as a way of getting started. Tim O'Malley is a faculty member at the McGrath Institute for Church Life at the University of Notre Dame, where he is the Associate Director for Research and Academic Director of the Notre Dame Center for Liturgy. He's authored several books, including Becoming Eucharistic People, and most recently, Behold, Believe, Become, Meeting the Hidden Christ in Things We See, Say, and Do at Mass, published by Ave Maria Press. Cassidy Klein is here with us from Chicago. Cassidy is a journalist, a writer, an editor, based in Hyde Park. You can look at her work at Cassidy R. Klein at Weebly.com. She writes often for U.S. Catholic and Sojourners. I'm sure many of you are familiar with her work, and hopefully you've had a chance to read these two articles in the current issue of the magazine. What we're going to ask each of them to do to begin is to briefly summarize what they had to say in the magazine. And then I'll ask them a couple of questions probably. And then at the end, after that, we will have time for your questions. And the way that's going to happen is through the chat function. I know we all know how to use these things now post-COVID, but just in case you're unfamiliar, look down at the bottom probably of your screen and you will see chat, and you click on it and you can type a question. I will see those questions and I will pose them on your behalf. So that's how it's going to work. We will do that sometime after the bottom half of the hour, and we will be done by 5 minutes to the next hour. So you won't be here for longer than a full hour, and we thank you for joining us. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Tim O'Malley. If you could talk with us for a little bit about your article, Spectacle versus Sanctity, the difference between influencers and charismatics in the church.
Well, Jon, yeah, thanks so much for having me here. And it's a real delight to share this space with Cassidy and to speak a little bit about celebrity in the church. Again, my article, I've had a lot of interest over the years, I think, in this question of celebrity in the church. And much of it came with an addiction that I'm trying to get over myself to paying attention to online when a famous person would become Catholic in particular, right? There was so much sort of emphasis on, well, they're Catholic and suddenly what are they saying and what good could they do for the church, right? Because they're a celebrity, right? It's not the kind of sort of energy we devote to someone who just entered the church, in our parish who perhaps no one knows. And so, I really have a kind of a question, which is, what is the difference between fame, that is, famous people who are Catholic, and I suppose sanctity or holiness that attracts people that we might even sort of think about to a certain extent as fame? And so, I begin the essay by raising the problem and, what is sanctity and what is fame? What's the difference between spectacle and holiness? And as someone who did his PhD on Augustine of Hippo, and I think through the whole world in light of Augustine, I turned at the beginning to, sort of objections that could be raised about my concern around sanctity, right? St. Augustine of Hippo in his De Doctrina Christiana, or on Teaching Christianity, notes, sort of quite clearly that, like the rhetoricians will use the rhetoric of their day to woo people to the gospel. And, so we have to, in essence, think about or employ those rhetorics to the day, right? For the sake of sweetness, as he says, a sort of sweetening of the word to make it salvific. And of course, not only is Augustine writing about this, but he himself is one of those, well, kind of famous people, right? People come to hear Augustine preach on a Sunday in Hippo. We know this because his sermons, well translated by New City Press, I should say, sort of have these moments where quite clearly, he's addressing people coming in to hear him and figure out what's going on. And, I think it's not just Augustine, but if you pay attention to so many saints, they did attract a kind of fame even in the course of their lifetime. I mean, St. Francis of Assisi was among the most well-known persons in his day. St. Andre Bessette, a Congregation of Holy Cross saint that we love at Notre Dame, millions of people came to his funeral. And John's own writing upon St. Teresa of Calcutta in this edition notes, right? Everyone knew who she was. So it then led me to the next question, which is if fame is sort of part of it, what's the distinction today? And, I think what I'd like to hint at is that the rhetoric of our day is particularly, if I might use the phrase, demonic, in a way that Augustinian rhetoric was distinct, right? I mean, the rhetoric of our day is the image, and the image sort of testifies to you like a certain truth or reality. The sort of iconic rhetoric of our day is discernible in an Apple commercial, right? Where if you don't get your kid an iPhone, she will not record for you this coming Christmas a beautiful image of your family that you'll have for all time, right? It's a rhetoric that is separating truth from reality, truth from what's happening. And so, it's a rhetoric that manipulates, that does violence. And I think the dilemma, is when Catholic evangelizers take up such rhetoric for the sake of the gospel, right? They actually manipulate people. It's not a free response of love, which Augustine was very concerned about with the most, as he said, flourishing or the most sort of severe form of rhetoric of his day, right? So you have to offer this kind of rhetoric with the freedom to say yes. And I think a lot of Catholic influencers today, celebrities, they send something in your inbox that aren't about freedom or free response, but it's designed to make you feel terrible. Everyone's leaving to the church. The world is falling apart. And guess what? I have the thing that will save you, right? So it's a rhetoric that manipulates, right? That forces a kind of violence. It also sort of relies on a kind of popularity, right? Augustine, Francis of Assisi, St. Teresa of Calcutta, right, were pursuing sanctity, and fame came along with it. I think the dilemma when you think about Catholic influencers is it goes the other way. You pursue fame and sanctity might come along with it, or it might not, right? So branding, right? This sort of language, what's your brand? Or, the way that you have to sort of use everything in your life to create a perfect image or sort of a sort of aura around you that's radically untruthful, right? It attracts eyeballs, it gets people interested, but it also is a lie, right? I think about bloggers, right? Catholic family bloggers, and it's always like children who are like dutifully in prayer or happily digging holes, right, in this earthbound well, in reality, as a dad of kids, right, my own life is harder than that, right? My children don't have euphoric prayer experiences, but in fact, sort of, as my son asked at Mass this week, or he drew on our little program this week, when it said the dismissal, he's like, this is my favorite part. And I was like, okay, right? So this is the reality of raising children. And so there's difficult dimensions that, are shared. Finally, there's the gap. Influencers aren't who they always say they are, right? It's one, there's a kind of obsession right now with the Jonathan Rumi, who plays Jesus in The Chosen. And I think people sort of encounter him like they've met Jesus, but you haven't. You've met Jonathan. who plays a character and I hope has had his life changed by it, but he is famous for playing someone who actually is important, and that's kind of the move we have to make. And I suppose actual the final end is this, which is that all of this I think exists in a sphere that makes us forget that Christian life is incarnational out in the world. It's not participating in all these sort of um, advertising campaigns and social media accounts. It's like, I don't know, flesh and blood stuff, caring for the poor, welcoming the stranger, caring for the migrant, visiting the prisoner. This is the stuff of Christianity, not that actually does convert. It does lead to this. It's rhetorically actually more persuasive, but it's not about pursuing spectacle or celebrity. It's in fact integrity, right? Who I am. So that's kind of what I wrote forward. I don't have a lot of hope, I must say, about influencer culture, and sort of we're only one great advertising plan away from bringing the church back. I think real sanctity is always going to be the basic stuff: prayer, contemplation, care for the hungry and the thirsty, and those hidden acts of love that no one will ever see, right? And that is the love of the communion of saints. So that was my contribution to this month's edition.
Thanks very much, Tim. So I really want to ask you now to sort of dig in where you began, which is your own personal experience with this culture that you can't help but be a part of because you are someone that people want to listen to in the church, and you have gotten the credentials to be someone that people ought to listen to in the church. And you've had the ambition enough to write books, to be listened to, and to give big talks at conferences and things. So how do you balance this? I mean, personally, one of the reasons why I was really interested in you writing a feature article for this issue is because you are one of these people. You're one of these people who is, some level of celebrity in the church. So how do you manage this? Because, it takes a platform to be heard, to be able to woo people to the gospel. So are there practices you can recommend that you're trying to follow to keep yourself balanced in this way?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's the fact that so I really do believe. I think everything I've ever written or everything I've ever done has been linked to things I believe, and that I want to say because I think they're true. The secret about me is that I wish that I'm a dad and a husband who like is pretty monastic in his life and prefer sort of solitude and sort of so I actually don't get much out of these crowds. I mean, I'll do it, right? I mean, in some sense, I'm a teacher, and I think that's the other dimension is I have a full-time job, right? So this is, in the end, I have to email like 35 people today about things that have nothing to do with this, and that's my full-time job. So in some ways, right, it's the full dimension of my life. That's the practice for me, and then I come home and, I think it's been very salutary for me to have a wife in my case who has literally never read anything on purpose that I've written. And so there is like not at all talking about my life in this way. Like my kids don't care what I do. And that's sort of salutary. So for me, it's not even like a balance. I will say this, like, I jumped on like social media, especially like Twitter early back when it was, novel. And I think I've been very attentive to think about the ways that these sort of social media manipulate my own encounter with reality. The way that like I start to experience relationships with people, right, as something that I can brand or express about my identity. And it's really challenging to avoid this. And it's why, you know, I've over the last 3 years tried to tone down my usage to the point where this Lent was the first time I was like, I don't care if I've written anything or if anything's coming up. I don't need to be on there. And I'm exploring the possibility that I only have to be on there once a week in order to fulfill my obligations to my institute, my publishers, etc. But then I'd like to spend the rest of my life not on there, and not sort of playing this game. So that's a sort of newer conversion for me. That I'm actually a better teacher and a writer and a scholar and a prayer when I'm not on there, sort of playing the game, than I am when I am. So those are some thoughts, but I'm not good at it, and you know, I I do get the pressure when every time you write a book, your publisher's like, "What are you going to do with this?" And how many, how many followers do you have who will buy this book? And I find that logic somewhat terrifying and monstrous.
Yeah, I understand, and I have a personal involvement in this too because I'm on the other side of that desk, usually asking someone like you those questions. So
Yeah.
I feel sort of guilty as charged as well, which is why this topic was of interest to me as well. In the issue of the magazine, that we're talking about, I have an interview with Father Ron Rolheiser. I don't know if you had a chance to see it. I'm not going to ask you
Mhm.
about the interview, but um, I know that Ron talks about Mother Teresa, and he's done this on many occasions, where he'll say, don't be fooled that to be one of the greatest Christian celebrities in the world, like Mother Teresa. It doesn't mean you don't have ego. She had a lot of ego, a lot of ego. It's just a matter of how was it used, to what purpose. I mean, is that part of it too?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm an Augustinian through and through, and like I just recognize that I'm a terrible sinner, and that I'm very tempted. So the Psalms are my prayer each morning, and they keep me remembering that I ground my being in something that precedes me rather than that I self-create or make. And so that's what I get meant by sort of this monastic dimension, right? If I pray the Psalms every morning, and if the first words out of my mouth in the morning after like "Where's the coffee?" is, "Oh Lord, open my lips." I remember that what I speak and what I do and what I say is not the result of me, but a gift that's been given. And in that sense, um, it's the ego doesn't go away, but it is knit into Christ. And so that's kind of my goal, is to let my eye enter into Christ. And in that sense, the what I say or write or do, right, is a manifestation of that more than it is a manifestation of Tim, even if it has a Timness to it. And that I think is sort of how I handle it.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you. So we will come back to Tim O'Malley in a few minutes with your questions. You who are watching and listening, you will see that I put an invitation there in the chat to say, please put your questions here and I will see them and I'll pose them for you. But now we're going to turn to Cassidy Klein, a journalist from Chicago. Cassidy, I was really interested in having you to be a part of this conversation from the get-go because of your journalistic perspective. There's a way in which you are supposed to, in some way, critique things like Catholic celebrities, right? You're not just meant to trumpet what they're doing, but to critique them a bit. And I love the way that you write about pop culture and the saints and celebrity culture in the magazine. And I'm turning it over to you.
Thank you so much, John. Yeah, and great to hear from Tim. Yeah, so grateful to be here with you all. Yeah, so when John kind of first proposed this question of like writing a piece about like saints and celebrities, the first like image that came to my mind was these like celebrity saint candles that are in a lot of like gift shops, and I've like seen them. I don't know, just kind of like out and about, even in like some friends' homes of like, it will be like a celebrity like Dolly Parton or Taylor Swift or like Michelle Obama or someone, and they're kind of like look like a saint on this candle. And so just like that image of that and kind of being a starting off point of like, how do we wrestle with like kind of this like crossover of like pop culture and sainthood and Catholicism when and this is something I've also kind of noticed of like Catholicism, like the sort of aesthetics of it almost like being really popular even among people who like aren't Catholic. Um, so yeah, did some research, and Vox did a whole article about these saint candles, um, and something that the reporter said that I found was interesting is that like you know, sort of replacing saints with these celebrities sort of retains the comfort of ritual for some people, even if they don't practice the faith itself. So yeah, I was just thinking a lot about like how, like what that means to be part of community or want to find community or belonging, and how for some people like celebrities are that, and for better or for worse, I think. But for as Catholics and people of faith, like what does it mean for saints to like embody almost part of like our identity or how we express ourselves? I was thinking back a while ago, I sort of wrote an article sort of wrestling with like the question of like, has Catholic identity become like a brand, quote unquote? And David Cloutier, he is a theologian. I talked to him, he's an economic theologian too, but I talked to him about like consumer society. And one of the things that he said is that like in our consumer society today, like goods are marketed not simply for like their function or what they do, but that they're an expression of our identity. Like people like decorate their houses in certain ways, not just for functional reasons, but because it's like expressing who you are. So I was thinking a bit about that question with like saints and pop culture. But yeah, another interesting thing is that that I touched on in the article is like, especially since the pandemic, I've been reading more online about, they're called parasocial relationships. So kind of one-sided relationships that someone might have with a celebrity or a sports team or a social media influencer, and where that person like invests a lot of time and energy into that relationship, but the other person doesn't know they exist. So I think a lot of fans of like Taylor Swift are kind of known to be part of this, like Swifties sometimes. But yeah, like the National Institute of Health did like a study on this, and they're like, there's both positive and negative effects of this, but these relationships can also like be harmful when they can easily become really all consuming and kind of like affect one's everyday life, and taking them away from like in-person communities. So yeah, I was thinking about that in contrast with relationships with saints, and how for us like the saints are interceding for us, walking with us, when and we can like engage with them in a really personal way that's not just one-sided. So yeah, I was really thinking about that. And then I read a book recently called The Mystics Would Like a Word by Shannon K. Evans. It's a new book that she has out, and she was talking about Saint Therese, and specifically this like influencer culture and sort of celebrity fame culture in our world today, especially with social media. And yeah, kind of like the internet, especially trying to like sell us a brand or sell us like belonging almost, that that Saint Therese can be like a really, I don't know, helpful like friend, or just presence with us, in that of showing us a spirituality that's like really small and humble, like her little way, kind of rejecting the pressure to perform and produce. And yeah, ultimately that it all comes back to love. And I think that's a really important point. And also back to, kind of like Tim was saying, like freedom, like this freedom to like, who am I really before God? What is the sacred part of myself? And is that being honored? And so, yeah, Evans writes that like she needs Saint Therese to help remind her that her worth is not tied to like social media followers or sales numbers, but it's always back to love, and that the interior, matters more than the exterior. So, yeah, that was a bit of background to my article, and I think, I'm trying to look over. Yeah, I think, I have come across like a couple more examples of just like saints sort of embodying that call to love of God and love of neighbor. So that was the inspiration behind the article.
Thank you, Cassidy. I found and I find still your juxtaposing of the the influencer of today. Every parent of a teenager has heard probably at one time or another the desire to become a YouTuber, and your
Mhm.
heart thinks. I've certainly heard it. That compared to Therese of Lisieux, I found and I find that comparison so interesting in part because it's so true, but also because then Therese of Lisieux, after her death, then became the most famous saint in the world. Uh,
Right. Yeah.
so she became a Catholic celebrity, like that,
Yeah. Yeah.
um, which isn't really a question. It's just an ironic comment, I guess. The question I want to
Definitely.
ask you is an unfair question because it's a huge question that I really want to ask everyone who's attending our
Mhm.
webinar today. But I want you to give a stab at it, and I want everybody to think about it, which just is, how do we encourage the making of saints? Because all of us, as whatever kind of Christians we are, we want to encourage the making of saints. I mean, that's what it's all about. How do we do that without pedestal rising living people to sainthood?
Mm, yeah. Oh man, yeah, that is such a good question. I think what's coming to me right now, and this is like just a more personal level, I'm working through the Ignatian exercises right now. I'm doing the 19th annotation, so like over 9 months. And I think one of like the most powerful things has been this like what does it mean to have interior freedom and spiritual freedom and like not seeking wealth over poverty or success over failure, kind of that like sense of deep freedom. And yeah, seeing how like Ignatius, did become so famous and like the exercises are so famous, and but how many lives that they've transformed. And so yeah, like does it come back to um yeah, to freedom and like honoring of all of our dignity and each of our call in the world, but also not putting people on a pedestal. Like, I don't know, I guess the example of the Ignatian exercise is like, I'm so grateful for Ignatius and like know that he was human and he was, had like a really complicated life and did a lot, but he produced this really good thing. And so how do I, you know, wrestle with that? But yeah, it's a really good question.
In the conversation with Tim earlier, I made reference to the interview I did with Father Ron Rollheiser in this issue of the magazine. And in that interview, I sort of very quickly confessed when talking with Father Ron that this is an issue for me because as a book publisher several years ago, I I published someone who has since been disgraced, who was a Catholic celebrity, and I put marketing copy on the back of his book calling him a living saint. But I did that because everybody did that. I mean, that's just the way that we described him before we knew what was wrong. And just yesterday, I was cleaning out the desk that I'm sitting at, and I was cleaning out a bunch of old business cards, and I came across another uh, such person who I'm not going to name, but the card is sitting here on the desk in front of me because I thought it was poignant since I'm about to do this conversation with you and Tim today of another person who I was about to publish years ago who then was disgraced. But I just don't know how to avoid this. In if you're involved in Christian ministry, if you're involved in the gospel, if you're involved in trying to evangelize, if you're trying to make saints in any way, it's a very difficult.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I think, yeah, I think like I, for a different article, was researching about like the canonization process itself and like kind of how much it's also changed more in recent times and how like, how quickly since starting in the 20th century, especially Pope John Paul II, like canonizations happened really fast. And um, yeah, it's really hard because it's almost like you have to have a certain amount of faith and also still remember that like people were human, but they're also saints. So it's like this, like, yeah, messy contradiction that you have to, I think you just have to hold the truth of like all of that. And especially, um, just think critically too. And yeah.
And we all, I think, have to find ways to raise the voices of people who don't have a platform of any kind.
Mhm.
And it's getting so difficult to do that now. I just want to pull Tim back in for a second, and then we're going to turn to questions that I have on the screen in front of me. Um, Tim, as a teacher, I would imagine that you spend a lot of time trying to figure out how to, create, raise voices, encourage voices of those who don't, have a big platform and who aren't necessarily looking for it, but who have a voice that needs to be heard. I mean, aren't there ways we can find to do that? Our culture is making it more and more difficult.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the great delights for me is to hear the voice that needs to be heard amongst my students, who are writing and trying out ideas and thoughts and sort of aren't famous. And that they'll, as I like to remind my undergraduates, most of us within 100 years of dying will be forgotten. So I'm happy. I like happy moments, like thinking about sort of our own forgetfulness. So yeah, I mean, I think to delight in the presence there, in the word that's there, for me, of my students, of saying, okay, how do I uphold this, uphold it to the class, uphold it to the meaning of their life, even if it's never to be published. And in fact, it probably won't be published. And yet it had meaning as a sort of exercise of their own writing and thinking that's intrinsically worthwhile to them. And in fact, more worthwhile than what, Father Mike Schmitz will say. And this is not against Father Mike, but it's more worthwhile to them than what he's going to say on a podcast, right? It was a transformation for them. And no one may read it, but that doesn't make it any less important. I mean, well, first of all, I read it. And so, but there's, their parents could read it, but it's important to them. And I want them to hang on to it. And so a lot of it, I think, is sort of the delighting in the mundaneness of insight and their own insights, which maybe some of them get published. I sent you a student, as we were talking about, who I think does have a voice and won't have a voice unless people advocate for her to have a voice, because she's not going to have 6 million followers for doing anything, and she's not going to document what her avocados look like this afternoon, right? So she's not doing that. That's not who she is. And so we owe, I think, in my assessment, I owe it to students like that to say, like, you have a voice that needs to be heard. And I hope publishers take a risk on you.
What Tim is making reference to is that I recently asked him, almost in desperation, can you please point me to a student of yours, who, some smart student who has something interesting to say, because we need younger voices in the magazine. And we have a wonderful essay by this student, former student of Tim's, in the next issue of Living City. So let me turn to the questions that have come in from people who are watching. One is from John. Can we find, have, or build a stronger relationship with God by leveraging online social media platforms such as Facebook, Instagram, X, etc.? Can those actually be used for good? Either one of you or both, please.
Yeah, I think social media is definitely a place that can be used for good, and that I think we have to be careful to like still cultivate who we are outside of social media. I think what's interesting is that like a lot of um, people, I think especially since the pandemic, people who might not like always feel comfortable going to church. I'm thinking of like a lot of queer Catholics have found community on social media, like faith communities on social media have seemed to really thrive. And so I think in terms of connection across location and like interest, it allows people to kind of find these like hyper specific places, um, which I think can be good. I think also, yeah, we have to like cultivate um, time where we're also like not being advertised to, because I feel like on social media it's like you're always seeing advertisements and you have to like remind yourself that like you're not a product too. So kind of, yeah, it can be good for building community. I really do believe that. And I've met friends, you know, through social media and stuff like that, but also knowing that like, yeah, I'm a human being and have to cultivate that too. So yeah.
Yeah, let me agree with everything Cassidy said about sort of community and, friends and even works of mercy that can be done through meeting people online, right? There's people who I've met and been with and shared life with. And so I don't want to deny those things. I do think we have to follow the church's own insights here, though. I think especially around some of the dangers of these sites that are not just about like, okay, I need to get off of them because I'm, sort of not in the world anymore. But they're designed by people who want to manipulate you. And, like the algorithms are designed to manipulate you. And I think even our own sense, this is a topic for another day, but of the sort of radical polarization in the United States actually comes about because we live in a world where that sort of like fighting and logic and disagreement raises and shows more eyeballs than somebody, who's not doing that. So, I mean, I will say that the church is really concerned about, these platforms, the Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, for the most part, don't charge you money, and they don't charge you money for a reason, right? And they're in it to get eyeballs on what you say. And in that sense, when we play into that game, we're also playing into those structures that are manipulative, that are doing actually psychological harm to a lot of the young people that I work with. And so, especially those who spend roughly 4.5 to 5 hours per day on these sites, as many of my undergraduates do. So while I'm all for finding a stronger relationship with God and meeting people, I do want to remember that, right, that these are that underlying some of these are the powers and principalities of our day, rather than just neutrality.
Thank you, both of you. I'm going to ask a question from Mike. I'm going to ask it a little bit differently than Mike asked it, but basically the question is, what do you think about Catholic celebrities who build relationships or seem to build relationships with politicians and social media influencers in order to, bump up their own audience and platform? Is that ever good? Is it inevitable? Is there no turning back? I mean, can you comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's always dangerous when the church cedes authority to the polis, especially influence authority, right? I suppose I remain enraptured by what I learned in economics is there's no such thing as a free lunch. And when you trade X, Y, or Z for X, Y, or Z, don't be surprised sort of what that trading has come for. So, I think the church needs to be engaged in political affairs and thoughtfully and engage. And I think one of the challenges is I think you can play into things that get you power or get you money, right? I'm going to talk this way and not that way because I know, right? If I actually, for example, say something like, if I say that I'm pro-life in this way and not that way, I will gain influence among this group of people. And of course, we all make those decisions every day, but make that decision again and again and again and again and again, and find yourself not thinking about your own sort of work as a minister, a preacher, exclusively as cultivating favor of donors and those who you can sort of attract, the powerful and the prestigious. I love what Cassidy said about Ignatius's exercises, right? I mean, I think there's something about Ignatius's exercises that can serve as a medicine against that, right? Because, have you chosen the weakness of the cross? Have you chosen, which of the banners are you placing yourself under? And I'm too much of an Augustinian to believe that none of us, even the most virtuous at the beginning, won't find ourselves adoring an idol at the end. I think the the path to goodwill to idolatry is a lot shorter than we think.
Yeah, absolutely. I would, yeah, agree with so much of that. I think I was also thinking about like, what Jesus says about like, you know, not being of this world and like what does it mean to be set apart? And to me that I just don't think that looks like, you know, sort of buddying up with like really powerful people. And it's like who was Jesus with? Like he was with the marginalized and the oppressed and the ones who like were not in these seats of power. So it always makes me a little uneasy, I think, when I see that sort of conflation happening with sort of Catholic celebrities and politicians. And yeah.
I have two more good questions to ask the two of you. One of them is from a St. Augustine fan, clearly. But it's a great question because it relates to what we've been talking about. It relates to my confession of raising a Catholic leader to living sainthood mistakenly about a decade ago. And it relates to St. Ignatius and St. Augustine, as Tim and Cassidy have been talking about them. The question is, perhaps it's better to concentrate on someone like Augustine than to put our faith in any one preacher today. It's not really a question, it's more of a statement, but I mean, it does suggest a question. Should we reimpose the old guideline for sainthood that we have to wait a lot of years before we even open the question? Do we need to reserve those we raise up on a pedestal to 1500 years ago for Augustine, or 450 years ago for St. Ignatius?
Yeah, I've had a professor friend say, the more famous you are in your life, the longer you should wait. And, I think the classic example in the church is John Henry Newman. I mean, everybody knew the works of John Henry Newman in England at the time he died, right? I mean, they knew about his conversion, they knew his preaching, right? He was like among the central figures of his time. And he waited a lot longer, right, than a lot of people wait for a sanctity, right? And why? Well, because as time moved along, devotion didn't stop, right? And it turns out that he was a saint not because he was famous or a famous theologian, but because actually he was holy. And the devoutness of his life came clear in 150 years. And it didn't matter to John Henry Newman, right? He wasn't, saints aren't waiting up in heaven and saying like, oh man, when do I get added to the official canon? I'm not yet. Okay, there I am. Like I'm next to Augustine, but nobody's remembering me. So I think in that sense, distance, the more famous you are, the more distance there should be. But if you're an unknown Algerian martyr, that's very different than if you are, a current pope, for example, right? I mean, everybody knows Pope Francis. Everybody knew Pope Benedict. Distance matters. Does the devotion remain, in 100 years, 150 years? And if so, then, santo subito at that stage, right? But before then, maybe slow down.
Yeah, I think that's really wise. I think it was someone I talked to for a different article kind of looking at like folk saints was saying that like um Pope John Paul II kind of rolled back the rule of like waiting 50 years, like you had to be dead for 50 years before they could open a canonization process for you. And so like then there were just like tons of canonizations and which is in one way they were like saints were coming from more like global backgrounds, not just all European, which was good. But I do feel like there is like a lot of wisdom um in the distance that Tim was talking about like is the devotion still there? Is there like what is arising among people, and like is that devotion still alive? So yeah, I think that's wise.
All right. So John has this question. Can we think or should we consider new online algorithms like AI as in any way workings of the Holy Spirit?
I have to admit, I'm tempted to point to Cassidy's very wise description of Ignatius, which is, I mean, everything in principle is workings of the Holy Spirit, but that they are doesn't mean that they are workings of the Holy Spirit, right? So I think in that sense, discernment of spirits is always necessary. I think someone could have said like Nazi Germany, sorry to sort of, are workings of the Spirit, right? Because they're the history of the moment of the day. But in fact, they weren't. I mean, hopefully we all agree. And if we don't email me. That those were not workings of the Spirit, right? So, I mean, I think I'm much more Ignatian, I have to admit in this, which is, we have to discern the signs of the times, and not every sign of the time is all good or all bad. I get that. But I'm really, I mean, I think the Spirit is working in the world, and I am attentive to that gift, but I also think the opposite spirits are working in the world too. And so I am always careful to see what's about, and to be attentive to that. So Cassidy, thank you for Ignatius, who I think has been my banner actually through this conversation. You got me off of a dustbin. Thanks.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, I think I feel like I don't feel like I know enough about AI, but I mean so much of it just feels talking about discernment of spirits like feels alarming inside me, or just kind of like, yeah, like clingy or something. Like it just seeing how it's just like everywhere, and yeah. It feels a little alarming. So I think it's, yeah, requires a lot of discernment. Also kind of the yeah, people being just thoughtful about how it's being used and for what end. Is the end love and service of neighbor, or is it like something else that's maybe not always toward the end of love? I don't know, but that's a good question.
Well, Desi has a final question for us, and then we'll be done. And that is, how, in your experience, can you be a peacemaker in what is a polarized world of social media and celebrity, the culture that supports all of those things, and that we all are a part of in one way or another? How are you a peacemaker in that world? It's a great Focolare question.
Yeah, that is a really great question. And I think, yeah, one that I think about a lot just in our world where there is like so much violence and suffering all the time that we like especially see through social media. I feel like a lot is another aspect of it. I think, yeah, I think for me, like just being, yeah, going back to Ignatius, like using sort of that sense of discernment of spirits of like, where am I called to show up in the world, and like, especially in terms of the suffering, like where is God calling me to be present to the suffering, and to um, yeah, like I think that's helped me a lot in discerning like what, social justice movements am I gonna really devote my time to and be part of and show up for, and how can I even show up for my community, like when people are burned out, how can I just be more of a presence to them, or help with chores or cooking, like even really small things like that. I think sort of keeping that sense of like, how can I cultivate a life where all things are pointed toward love of God, even when things do feel so polarizing and scary. But it's, yeah, a really good question, and one I'm thinking about a lot.
Yeah, I'll be brief, which is I actually think humor. I suspect most people just take themselves so seriously on these platforms, and they believe that like they're just one argument away on this platform from right, changing everything. But of course, yeah, I think as Cassidy was pointing out, right, I mean, part of what I think when you learn to be a peacemaker is you learn that, like, well, actually real life relationships are where it's at, and there's real justice movements afoot. And you know, so there has to be, like, to enter into these spaces and reveal them at certain times for the absurdity that they are, right? And that's what I mean by humor, is sort of sort of a apocalypticism of humor, right? I mean, you know, 8 seconds after something happens, everybody has an opinion and now has to debate as if it's war. But we are all people on digital devices that possess none of the power to do many of the things we think we're doing. And so we have to laugh at it, right? We have to laugh at it and reveal, like, oh, well, you know, like, you know, I've changed the world because I sent out a 70-character tweet. No, you didn't. It's just funny. It's funny. Okay. So we can laugh and joke and be human and be friends, therefore create a space of friendship and communion and hospitality in these spaces that I think people notice, because it's a different way of speaking. The algorithm may not notice you as well, but your actual real life future friends will.
It is interesting, isn't it, how our conversation about celebrity has evolved into a conversation focusing a lot on the culture that fosters celebrity of social
Yeah.
media. I will offer my own quick answer to Desi's question, which is very similar to yours, Tim. I try to do this a little bit every day, and I fail at it sometimes. But for me, it's to resist the temptation to be righteous, to be right, and even to be prophetic. I think social media has made it so easy to feel that you're doing good by saying the right thing, as you say, Tim, in 70 characters or whatever, which just simply means we are thrust back upon the necessity of real relationships and not overvaluing these electronic ones. So anyway, that's my answer to Desi. So I think that we are at the end. It is 6 minutes to the hour. I promised we'd be done by 5 to the hour. So I think we've come to a good closing point. I want to thank Tim O'Malley from South Bend, Indiana, and Cassidy Klein from Chicago, Illinois, for joining us on this Living City conversation, talking about celebrity in the church. Keep reading this issue of the magazine and join us next time.